Hi, I'm Dwayne O'Neill, and I'm one of the core administrators of the Family Tree DNA O'Neill project. This presentation is on the Cenél nEógain and the Royal O'Neills and their DNA connections. And the DNA information is current as of July of 2021 and would be updated with new information as it comes in the future. This presentation will provide an overview of the Cenél nEógain and the Royal O'Neills. They'll summarize their DNA landscape and detail the DNA haplogroups associated with these groups. And it'll mesh the DNA trees to traditional genealogy. The Cenél nEógain are a branch of the northern Nell, with the ancestor reported to be Niall of the 9 hostages who died in 405. The Cenél nEógain, or kindred of Owen, claimed descent from one of his sons. Their power base originally was in modern-day County Donegal, and they gradually spread their influence eastwards into the modern counties of Derry and Tyrone. By the 11th century, their power base had moved to just outside of Cookstown in County Tyrone. Their reign ended with their defeat by the McLaughlins around 1000. Here's a map showing their territory and with the surrounding neighbors around that point in time. The Royal O'Neills are of Tyrone and Clannaboy and shared the kingship of Ulster from the 12th to the 17th century. I've included this here, Royal O'Neills, in quotations just to identify that group as being a distinct group. Their ancestor was given the nickname Lazy Youth, who died in 1177. Their center of power was in County Tyrone and Armagh, and also covered southern Derry, southern Antrim, and the northern portions of County Down. The Royal O'Neills claimed descent from the Cenél nEógain to legitimize their authority, and they lost their power to the English around in the early 1600s, and this was symbolized by the flight of the Earls and Hugh O'Neill leaving Ulster for mainland Europe. Here's a map of their geographic extent. So continue from the O'Neill of the Fuse through County Tyrone and the Tyrone O'Neills, or the Great O'Neill, then swooping over into the Antrim and with the Clannaboy O'Neills. Shows some of their neighboring clans. One of them I wanted to make note of is the O'Kanes to the north, and they were strong allies of the O'Neills through the century and are related to the Royal O'Neills. I want to list some of the material that I'm using in this presentation, and the first one is by Bart Jansky, and he has a series of genealogical tables listing the medieval Irish royal dynasties, which include the Cenél nEógain and other important family lines historically. And we'll be shortly using that material to provide more details. The second reference I want to highlight is by the authors Edwin O'Neill and John McLaughlin. Edwin O'Neill is actually one of the co-administrators of the FTDNA O'Neill project as well. And they wrote a paper in 2006 titled Insights into the O'Neills of Ireland from DNA Testing. And in that paper, they summarize DNA test results, and it was specific to STR testing. SNP testing wasn't widely available at that time. And in that paper, they, for the first time, highlight that there's some distinctions from an STR testing point of view between what they've called traditionally the Northwest Irish modal type. And as we'll see, it's related to the Cenél nEógain group. And then another group that they first identified here, and which had completely different STR testing results. And they labeled it the O'Neill variety. And as we see, the O'Neill variety is really associated with what I've labeled as the Royal O'Neills. And in that paper, they highlight or suggest that there was a break in the lineage of the Cenél nEógains to the O'Neill variety. And they thought that it was likely occurred when the McLaughlins took power from the O'Neills in the 1100s. The third reference I have here, just a standard Wikipedia reference to the branches of the Cenél nEógain. And the reason I put it in there is that this is an example where there's some general representation that the Cenél nEógain continued on in through the 12th to the 17th century. And in this reference, it includes the Clannaboy line of the Royal O'Neills as being a branch of the Cenél nEógain, which we'll see is very, very unlikely. The next reference, Argyll is remembered, but the O'Neill surname is just a general reference highlighting some of the history of the O'Neills. And the last reference by Desmond O'Neill it's called The Ancient and Royal Family O'Neills. And in this here, it's currently available as a CD. Desmond details out the O'Neill genealogy in through to the 19th century. And it's a valuable document in highlighting various branches of the O'Neills. Next year, we're going to go through the traditional genealogy. And this here is from Bart Jansky's material. And it starts off with Niall the Nine Hostages. At the top there, highlighted in the green circle, come down through his son, and then down through the green line with Fergus, who died in 722, as being the accepted line of the Cenél nEógain. And I wanted to highlight in the bottom left the grouping circled in the yellow circle, and this here is the lineage to the O'Kanes, and through another son of Fergus. And so that'll be significant later on when we describe some of the DNA information as well. So then we continue on from Fergus, okay, who died in 722. So I wanted to highlight that date because it'll be significant as well later on from a DNA aging point of view. And it comes down through here on this page, noticing all the branches and sub-branching of the Cenél nEógain. So it was a significant clade in Ireland. And so with 8 at the bottom here circled in green, we then continue on. So that is really, he died in 1033, and the McLaughlins then took over power of the kinship of Ulster at that time. Next graph here, we continue on with aid. And then there is a series of descendants, and it's a little bit murky here. There's some papers that say that there's suspicion that this may or may not be actual descendants. And then I want to highlight the individual here who died in 1177. And he had the nickname Lazy Youth. And he then led the O'Neills in regaining power. And from there, the lineage continues on. And as I mentioned, now I've identified this grouping as being the Royal O'Neills. And two of Lazy Youth's sons, one of them was the ancestor of the Clannaboys, which is shown on the left-hand side here. And then on the right-hand side, another son is the ancestor to the Tyrone O'Neills, which leads also to the Fuse. So I'd like to turn now to the DNA side. And with the Family Tree DNA O'Neill project, there's about 1,000 members in that grouping. And kits in that group, they've completed either one or more of the following tests, autosomal tests. And that test is information for all of one's family lines. And it goes back to about fifth cousins or so. So it's a fairly recent DNA information. A second test is associated with Y-DNA, and that is the male line only. So it would be from grandfather, from father to son to grandson. And that's the one that we're particularly interested in tracing the male lineage. The third one is mitochondrial testing. And that test is specific for the female line. For Y-DNA, there's three types of tests or information one can get. STRs, SNPs, and big Y testing. STR is an acronym, stands for short tandem repeat polymorphisms. And typically one can test to up to 111 STR markers. And that was a type of testing that was available originally. And one could then find matches that are associated with the different values on the repeats on each of these STR markers. And one of the disadvantages with STR markers is that they can, they're a little bit unstable, that they can change and then change back. And they're not necessarily consistent. Second test, SNP, it's an acronym, stands for single nucleoid polymorphisms. And these are variants that occur on a birth, and they occur occasionally. And but on these variants, they're stable in that they'll then continue on from son to grandson to great grandson. And as we'll see, they're used and for being able to do more accurate matching. Recently, in the past 5 years or so, there's big Y testing. And so the big Y testing is for, determines the SNPs, all of one's SNPs. And also, it also does the variants that are DNA changes that are unique to that particular kit. And they're labeled private variants, is that they're not shared with any other kit that has done a test to the current date. And if other kits new kits test, and they also have the same private variant, then they would be named and become a SNP. In the O'Neill project, there's two main groupings, one being the nEógain and the second being the O'Neill variety, equivalent to the Royal O'Neills. And then there's several what I've classified as old Irish groups that may have an O'Neill connection but aren't connected from a DNA point of view to the first two groups. This here is a listing of some of the kits associated with the O'Neill. And from a SNP point of view, starts off with P312. And then as a branch of P312 is M222. Then after several more SNPs comes down to S588. And on the left-hand side is a listing of the kits under the S588 group. And the order that is in this grouping is by STR values. And so it's not really that valuable on how these kits are interrelated. On the one side here is the listing of their haplogroups. And so those are the ones that are indicated in green. On the right-hand side is a subgroup of S588, being A5386. And that is, as we'll see, is one of several sub-branches. Another thing to take note here is that in looking at the most recent ancestor for each of these kits, you'll see that family names are quite varied, and that there's only a handful of family names that are O'Neill. And so this gives us an indication that the age of S588 is probably before surnames were common in Ireland, which was around the 12th or the 13th century. On this here view graph is the listing in the O'Neill project for the O'Neill variety. And it starts off here with, again, P312, which is common to the Cenél nEógain group. But it comes down and it has a different branch of P312, being Z4481. And then after a few more SNP variants, this grouping is Z1513. And on the left-hand side here are the subgroups 1B, 2, 3, and 4. And these kits are associated with the Tyrone and Fuse lines of the Royal O'Neills. On the right-hand side is group 1B1. And these kits are associated with the Clanaboy branch. And if you have a look at the ancestors listed here, about half of the kits have identified an O'Neill ancestor as a surname, which gives us an indication that Z1513 was formed likely close to when surnames became common in Ireland. So from a DNA point of view, as we mentioned, SNP haplogroups rather than STRs are more consistent DNA markers. SNPs on average form about every 83 years or so. And as highlight, P312 variant is the common variant to both the Cenél nEógain and the Royal O'Neills. And it actually has an age estimate of around 2000 BC, so they're very, very distant connection. The Cenél nEógain likely are associated with one of the S588 branches. And the Royal O'Neill's base haplogroup Z1513 is actually a block of 40 SNPs. And so that there's no other kits that have been identified to date where they broke up the block Z1513. So these 40 SNPs actually translates into an elapsed time of about 3,000 years. And so that's very interesting that it's sort of Z1513 descendants sort of appeared suddenly from a DNA point of view. Next, we'll move on to some of the haplogroup structure. Here we're going to be looking at S588. And for the S588, the DNA age estimate is approximately 500 AD, plus or minus 200 years. And this is through Ian MacDonald's age estimates. And S588 has several branches. And actually, there's a total of 14 branches here. And the largest branch is on the left-hand side is S608 and has an age estimate of about 620 AD, plus or minus 200 years as well. On this diagram, just to the immediate right of each block, as an example, in S603, there's the number of branches and sub-branches associated with that haplogroup. So here we have 125 branches and sub-branches of S65, which indicates that it's a very large and from a branch point of view, it's a flourished branch. And on that branch, okay, S603, it has again several sub-branches, and including BY3347. Then going down here comes down to S595, which with an age estimate of 1070 AD. And there are S595 is associated with the O'Kane lineage. And so there's been extensive work in detailing out S595, and it's been strongly connected to the O'Kanes, both from a geographic location and from surnames that have historically been connected to the O'Kanes, including, of course, the O'Kanes, McHenrys, and other surnames. Coming back up to other branches of S588, includes S7814, which has 51 branches and sub-branches. And another branch is A5386, slightly smaller, and also BY11432, which again is about the same size, about 12 branches and sub-branches. And then there is 11 other sub-branches that have been identified to date, and they altogether have a total of 26 branches and sub-branches. And so here, Fergus, as you might recall, died in 722 and is the ancestor of both the O'Kanes and the Cenél branches. And so that would then indicate that would indicate that Fergus would have had the haplogroup S is associated with haplogroup S588. And then the O'Kane line then would have had S603 develop along its line. And then that implies that the Cenél and the Cenél branches would have been associated with one of the other SNP branches, being S7814 or one of the other branches of S588. Now this here is a haplogroup structure of the O'Neill variety. And as mentioned before, it starts off with P312, and then it's a branch of P312 Z4481. Then there's several SNP variations after that, coming down to Z1513. And for Z1513, at present there are 4 sub-branches, and two of these are major sub-branches. FT32273, there's about 25 big Y kits that are associated with that, and this here is associated with the Tyrone and fuse lines of the O'Neills. And it has several branches and sub-branches, and there's at least 3 kits that have known Tyrone fuse lineage that have tested and that are connected to this branch. Over on the right-hand side, BY3292, there's about 25 kits as well that have done big Y testing, and one of those has a known lineage, a clan of Y lineage. And there's 3 branches under BY3292. Then below that, there's several sub-branches as well. In addition, there's 2 other branches that only have 2 kits each. And so from an age point of view, Z1513 is age estimate is around 1100 AD from a DNA point of view. And so from a summary point of view, these are the Cenél nEógain and the Royal O'Neills are 2 very distinctly different, have very ancestral lines, and from a DNA point of view as well. The Cenél nEógain, okay, likely descended from Fergus, who died in 722, and that's likely associated with the haplogroup S588. And then his son, okay, is likely associated with one of the DNA sub-branches shown here. On the other hand, the Royal O'Neills, their very early lineage prior to 1140 is unknown. And the Z1513 DNA age analysis of about 1100 AD is consistent with their ancestor of Lazy Youth, who brought the O'Neills back to power in 1176. So the kings of Ulster and the lineage break likely occurred around 1035 to 1175 AD, when the MacLauchlans came to power. From an overall point of view, the O'Neill project is just one example of many surname projects that have made significant advances through broad-based STR and big Y testing. We are now very close to relating identified haplogroups to specific Cenél nEógain and Royal O'Neill septs. I'd like to give a sincere thanks to all the kits who have done in the O'Neill project, who have done DNA testings, and especially the BY upgrades. I feel that we're in the golden age of genealogy research through broad range of genetic genealogy tools. Thank you.